Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us as we kick off this year's Brown Bag Lecture Series. This year is all about women, and so I'm so excited to have Dr. Lee Ann Caldwell here to kick it off with Women of Augusta, a historical overview. So just giving us the background knowledge that we need before we dive in for the rest of the year. Remember to share this video with your friends and family. Even though we are virtual, we still want these videos to have a far reach and a great impact. Happy National Hugging Day. I think it's so important that today's National Hugging Day, especially in the times we're in. So if you were able to do so safely, hug the people in your household and tell them it's National Hugging Day. Coming up on the calendar, we have the annual Jimmy Dias Symposium. We'll be honoring some great service members. That is Thursday, January 14th. So this upcoming Thursday at 5 p.m., the exact same way you are viewing this video here on Facebook and YouTube. Over at the museum, we have a new exhibit opening. It's called The Push for Innovation, and it'll be on exhibit starting January 28th. So come down to the museum Thursday through Sunday and see us for that exhibit. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Lee Ann Caldwell and her lecture. Thank you.
Well, good morning. Welcome to the 2021 Augusta Museum of History Brown Bag Series. And I have to tell you, this is the first time I've done this by film, and so it feels a little strange to be looking out at all these empty seats. I wish you were here because you don't know how much I enjoy my audiences and kind of seeing your reaction to some of the history I talk about. So it's a new adventure for me and a new adventure for Harvey White, a museum educator who is filming it for the first time. So we hope that it will turn out well and be something that you enjoy. This year's series is on women in Augusta, and there are some great women who will come after me in the coming months to talk about various topics that women have been involved in and some of the important women in Augusta. But my job today, as it always is in January, is to set the context by giving the history of the general history of women in this area. And so I'm excited to start kind of in the 18th century and come up to the present with this sort of general overall view. And since I can't answer your questions today, I will tell you that after you see this, and I think it airs next week, you are welcome to email me at caldwellleann@yahoo.com with any questions you have, and I'd be glad to email you back and answer them if I can. So with that said, let's talk about the history of women in Augusta in general. You know, even though Augusta was named for a woman, Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, who was the Princess of Wales, sort of the incoming Kate Middleton, I guess you could think of it. Even though it was named for her, in the early years of Augusta's history, there really weren't many women here. It was an Indian trading post. It was a rather wild area. In fact, the colonial secretary of Georgia, William Stevens, said that Augusta was a wild, lawless crew. That's not real attractive to women, and women who were raising families, which is what most women at that time were doing. There were regulations against dueling and eye gouging. But by the 1750s, there are families beginning to move in. It's not just the Indian traders, bringing their goods here, but there are other things beginning to go on, and including a little bit of commerce locally. And so we see things settling down. One good example of that is the request for a church in 1750, which of course resulted in St. Paul's Church, a congregation that is still going strong today. So there are more women beginning to move into the area. It takes a while. I mean, the first minister said that he had moved into the wilds of America. So it was still a little bit of a frontier, But we're going to see that change as we head toward the American Revolution, because the economy begins to change. In the outlying areas, it was farmers who had begun to move in, and they were families. And so there are women in the frontier, in the areas outside of Augusta, and of course that means there were women moving into Augusta itself. The Revolutionary period is a difficult period for women, because as men went to fight, women were left alone, and on farms in the outlying areas, they're left alone with their children against potential attacks from the enemy, whichever side that may have been. I'll talk about that in a second. Or potentially from Native American groups, especially up in the backcountry, where there were new farms and new settlements that still had many Native Americans nearby who resented the fact that their land had been basically taken from them. And so women held down the fort, so to speak, in many ways, in what in Georgia was a civil war. Because there were no troops. There were troops in Augusta, British troops in Augusta, for basically 2 weeks. The rest of the war was a war between neighbors, people who were on the Patriot side, the American Whigs, or people who were on the Tory side, American Loyalists. And so they're fighting each other, which makes it even more of a difficult war. After the American Revolution, white women gain a little bit of status, not much. It's not the change that some people like Abigail Adams had hoped that it would be when she told John Adams as they're writing the new government, remember the ladies, and he said, oh, we are far too wise to get rid of our masculine system. So we're not going to see any major rights coming women's way. But we do see a concept that we call Republican motherhood emerging. And the idea of that was that women were the nurturers and raisers of children. And in a republic, children had to be raised with certain ideas and virtues that made for good citizens. And so women needed to have more status, and they needed to have, in many cases, more education. And of course, that's going to make a tremendous difference before long. Augusta became a real town after the American Revolution. There were schools, there were churches, not just the Anglican Church, which of course became Episcopalian, but other groups beginning to move in, Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians. There was a library association, there were traveling performers, and eventually music and other kinds of cultural activities. In 1783, Richmond Academy had been founded for young men, and we're going to see also what were called female academies beginning to emerge, especially by the 19th century. Lord Sandwich, as he self-titled himself, started a female academy up in what became Somerville. It was being called that around 1800, and his academy was about that time. And we also see, for example, in 1815, a woman rented a room or 3 upper rooms actually, Mrs. Antoinette Smith, in the Academy of Richmond County, and began a female academy. Her specialty was needlework, so that says something, doesn't it, about the kinds of education women were to get. A lot of these academies taught basics like reading and writing, but also taught what were called ornamentals, things that would make women, as we would refer to it today, as good ornaments for their husbands. So this is especially for ladies of the middle and upper classes. The belief at the time was that women's brains were smaller than male brains, and because women tended to be physically smaller, and they just didn't think smaller brains could learn the things that bigger brains could learn. And so therefore certain subjects were just too difficult for female brains. That included Latin. I found a letter to a father, a local father, to his daughter, and he said he wanted her to cultivate modesty, sprightly but innocent language, cleanliness, grace in walking or standing. But don't let your brother teach you Latin. Latin's not for women. French was. French was considered the polite language, and it was considered quite polite for women to throw in, upper class women to throw in French words into their conversation. So they did get foreign language, it was just different. They were trained in music. They were trained in etiquette. All of those things that would make them good ladies of the household and desirable marriage partners. Women historians talk about this concept that emerged in the 19th century called true womanhood. And in true womanhood, there were 4 characteristics that women were supposed to develop: piety, chastity, domesticity, and submissiveness. It's interesting because I've read diaries of some women, and some of them struggled with this submissiveness thing. Some of them struggled with other things too, but especially the submissiveness thing. Some of them prayed to make me more willing to obey and be submissive. Gertrude Clanton Thomas, who I'll talk about a couple of times today, left a wonderful diary, for a 40-year diary. And she, in the diary, did what she could not do in public. She questioned things. She questioned the double standards between men and women. And in the Civil War, she's actually going to question some of the decisions that military and other leaders were making. So there were women who had good minds and were educated enough that they didn't always fit the mold quite the way they were supposed to. It wasn't always the ornamentals that attracted a man. I found in the Augusta Chronicle a notice for a debate that the Augusta Academic Society was holding, and they invited the public to come, and the question to be debated was, which is more desirable? A very beautiful and accomplished young lady with small or no fortune, or one of ordinary person, good sense, and a large fortune? So, as I said, other things could be attractive besides just the ornamentals. Augusta had several remarkable women in the 19th century, pre-Civil War. One was Octavia Walton Levert. She was the granddaughter of George Walton, signer of the Declaration of Independence. A very educated and accomplished young woman who spoke several languages and charmed people throughout the South. She's buried in the Walker family cemetery up in Somerville. Another was Gertrude Clanton Thomas, who I mentioned before. She was the daughter of the wealthiest planter in this area. She was educated at Wesleyan, the only college for young women in Georgia, and wrote that remarkable journal, which gives us some insight into what women may have been thinking about during that time. Another was Emily Thomas Tubman. Mrs. Tubman had married Richard Tubman, who died in 1836, leaving her with a considerable amount of money. And she became an extremely well-known philanthropist. She used it for good. She also got involved with the American Colonization Society, freed 50 of her slaves to go to Liberia. After the war, she would start a school, or endow a school, and homes for the aged, Tubman Homes. So there were philanthropists. We're going to have one of the lectures this year on philanthropists, and there have been women philanthropists for a long time in the Augusta area. Now, for Black women in the pre-Civil War 19th century, their lives were very different. Most were enslaved. And in Augusta, that meant that most were house servants. They worked for wealthy families who had them as cooks and nurses to children, and some of them worked in gardens. They did housekeeping, but basically worked in the household. It wasn't the same for African American women in the outlying areas. They worked in the fields along with men. One of the only examples of equality of work in the antebellum period, and that was because they treated female enslaved women just about the same way they treated male enslaved women. If there were African American women who were not enslaved, and there were, Augusta was an area that had a free black community, as did many urban areas. You don't find many free African American people in the countryside because plantation owners did not want free people as an example of freedom around enslaved people. But in the city, there were free people of color, male and female, and free families of color. I found a number in Augusta. One was the Dent family, and the family patriarch was a blacksmith, so had a way of earning a living, as many free black men were artisans of some kind. Henrietta Dent, however, married James Harris, who was a preacher that was what we now call Trinity CME Church, but pre-Civil War it was just the Methodist Church that had been allowed to be set up by St. John's Methodist Church. James Harris was technically not free, which is interesting. His wife was, which meant that all of their children were, but the congregation bought him. He was a slave in Athens, and the congregation bought him. So he was technically free because they allowed him to live as a free person, but when I tried to find him in the census with Henrietta and the children, he wasn't there. And I realized it's because technically he was not a free person, so he would not appear in the census that way. He was owned by his church, by the people who had purchased him. But a lot of these free women of color were involved in things like working as seamstresses, working as laundresses, working as cooks sometimes for families. Unfortunately, however, they didn't have a lot of rights other than the fact that their children could not be sold away from them, and they did have some freedom of movement, but not as much as we might think. Well, women got caught up, both enslaved women and white women, free women of color, got caught up in the growing tensions between the North and the South that led to the Civil War. A good example of that is local woman Catherine Cumming. She had married Joseph Bryan Cumming right at the end of 1860, and had actually been to visit her northern family. She was from the north, had been to visit her northern family in February of 1861, and of course the war itself had not started then. She wrote home that she thought no one doubted that a speedy reconciliation of disaffected states will soon be effected. But when she came back to Augusta in March, she found military companies were beginning to drill, and she realized that it wasn't going to be as speedy as she thought. And so for the war, she is separated from her family of origin in the north. And so she found herself, as one of her grandson's books, it's called A Northern Daughter and a Southern Wife. And she may have, I don't don't know. It's hard to know. Was she uncomfortable being Northern among these Southerners? We know that in World War I, she was very kind to German American families because she sort of knew how it felt to be someone who could be associated with the other side of the war. But she followed her husband, like many women did. They would go off to camp with their husbands or rent a place outside of where their husbands' units had been sent. And she did that for much of the war. In Augusta, women worked, white women and sometimes African American women, because they had no choice, worked for the war effort. An example of white women doing that was the Augusta Factory. The Augusta Factory was down where the first level of the canal goes into the second level canal, now at the intersection of Walton Way and 13th Street. And there was a huge factory there that had been there since 1848. And women worked in that, and it was charged with making uniforms, cloth uniforms, during the war. 750 people worked there. Almost all of them were female workers. Women met at the Masonic Hall in Augusta to sew. And so they get together and have these sewing circles, basically making all kinds of things that people needed that were going off to war. By March of 1861, a group was formed called the Ladies Gunboat Association. And the purpose of the Ladies Gunboat Association was to raise funds for a boat that would be put in the Savannah River to protect Augusta in case any Northern troops got up from the coast to the Augusta area. They raised their money, they got their boat built. It was just too heavy to come upriver, so it never made it upriver. And the Ladies Gunboat Association became the Ladies Volunteer Association, so they started doing other kind of volunteer work. They worked as nurses, especially in 1863-64, when Augusta became a hospital area after some of the battles, like the Battle of Chickamauga, later the Battle of Atlanta. This was a new idea, the idea of women nursing men who were not kin to them. Women nursing was not new. Women nursing men who were not in their families was indelicate, but they had to get over that because they had to use the women. In 1863, they demonstrated on Broad Street against high prices. Police had to be brought in to restore order. When Union troops threatened Georgia's coast, many male leaders in the community wanted to burn Augusta's cotton, which had been brought into Augusta for market. And they said they didn't want the Yankees getting up here and taking the cotton from them. And so the Ladies of Augusta, and that's how it was signed, wrote an open letter in the Augusta Chronicle to the, quote, gentlemen of Augusta that said, and I want you to notice the sort of cheeky way this is written, we learn that in the superior wisdom which characterizes your government of the affairs of the world, you have determined to burn all the cotton in the city upon the approach of the enemy. Now we, in our inferior wisdom, suggest that as the cotton, if burnt where it is now, would inevitably burn the whole city, you should take immediate measures to move it. They said they didn't want their homes burned down, particularly, they said, because they would not get credit for that sacrifice, which would be, quote, all ascribed to your patriotism. It's interesting to me, and another historian who's actually written a book on Augusta during the Civil War, that women were finding some voice in this war because decisions being made had impact on them and their children and their families. And so they're not going to be quite as submissive as they had been before. After the war, women helped in not only rebuilding the community socially and economically, white women also tried to rebuild the rather down morale of their defeated men by building monuments to the lost cause. Many wanted to honor the Confederate dead. And of course, we're talking about these monuments today. The Augusta monument was not built when most monuments were. Most of them were built around the turn of the century. This one was built in the 1870s, and it was by the Ladies Memorial Association to honor the Confederate dead. So that's one of the things that they kind of got involved in. But many of them had to help their families, including some white women who had been pretty privileged before the war. I'll go back to Gertrude Plantin Thomas. Her husband, Jeff, never got his act together after the war the way he had before. He almost like he didn't know quite what to do with himself, and he turned out to not be a very good manager of money. And so Gertrude had to help support the family, and she did what many women did. She became a school teacher. She opened a school. People paid to send their children to school. Two professions for women come out of the Civil War. One was teaching. In fact, by the turn of the century, teaching is going to be, especially at the elementary level, what's called feminized. Women are going to take over the profession of teaching at the lower level. Men still taught in high schools, and particularly in male academies like Richmond Academy. You're not going to find women teaching there. But we're going to see women, it becomes a way for women to earn money. And that has a lot of impact. I can't go into all this because I don't have enough time, but in essence, women now have a way that they can work before they get married if they want to. They don't have to go from one male household to another male household, and we're going to see that begin to happen. And for some of them, they don't have to marry at all if they don't want to, and so you get this image that emerges of the unmarried woman teacher, kind of the matriarch of a lot of girls' schools and that kind of thing. The other profession was nursing. And we're going to see nursing become acceptable because women did it during the war and they did it well. And we're going to see it become professionalized, which means that women are going to have to go to school and learn things to become nurses. Same thing with teaching. We're going to see more and more teaching becoming professionalized. Georgia founded a couple of teaching colleges for women. One was Georgia Normal and Industrial Institute. A normal school was a school to train teachers. And that came about as a result of really the advocacy of a young Augusta woman who was the daughter of immigrants, Swiss immigrants. Her name was Julia Flisch. And an editorial that she wrote appeared in the Augusta Chronicle saying, give the girls a chance. Give the girls some education and see what they can do. She pressed for the state government to do this. She had tried to get into the University of Georgia, and they said, oh, we don't take women. And she said the state should be providing some path to education for women. And the result was GNIC, which in the 1920s became Georgia State College for Women, which now is Georgia College and State University in Milledgeville, Georgia. And it was a fine, fine girls' school. Julia ended up teaching there, and she tried to keep it on a path where women were offered the same kind of courses and at the basic level that men were. Poorer women, white women, went to work in the factories that were emerging in Augusta. Augusta was really a New South city. They built major factories like the Enterprise Mill, the King Mill, the Sibley Mill, and pretty soon after the war in the 1870s and early 80s. And women and children went to work in those factories. In fact, it was seen as almost like a good charitable thing to do to hire women and children, especially widowed women and children, in factories, because then they could support themselves. There were mill housing. We still see some of it up in the Harrisburg area. And there were all these mill neighborhoods that began. mill villages tended to be out of urban areas, but we definitely had neighborhoods like Harrisburg, Frog Hollow, Hicksville, Rollersville, the West End, and others. So all these neighborhoods around the mills, Frog Hollow, for example, being around the Enterprise Mill and Augusta Factory, and in Harrisburg, you see some of these other mill areas. The work week for these women and their children, 72 hours in the beginning, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. A couple of strikes by the end of the century got it down to 11 hours a day, 6 days a week. That's a lot of work. Eventually, we're going to see more and more families filling up the mill villages as men came in to work in the mills as well, people moving in from the farm areas and working in the mills. Upper class women, after the war, as I said, some of them worked, but those who didn't have to, many got involved in philanthropy, back to charitable work. There was a movement sweeping the nation by the late 19th century called the Maternal Commonwealth. And the idea was that women could do things that would make society better, kind of being mothers, maternal mothers to society. In Augusta, women founded groups like the King's Daughters, which was a national movement. They started chapters in Augusta. The Girls' Home Club to teach young women, especially mill women and other poor women, what increasingly were called domestic arts. The Sheltering Arms Daycare Center to take care of the children of mill women who were too young to go to work. The West End Free Library, the Mary Warren Home, which was a place that women who could no longer work in the mills could live out the rest of their lives. And we see this in the African American community as well. One of the new residents to Augusta in the 1880s was Amanda America Dixon, and we're dedicating a historic marker to her in March of this year. Amanda was the daughter of one of really the wealthiest plantation owner in Hancock County, Sparta, and one of his name was David Dixon. One of his enslaved women, Julia, who became really the runner of the household, and he raised Amanda in his household. In fact, her white grandmother, she stayed in the same room with her white grandmother. So she was raised to be a lady, and she was educated. And then after the war, she went to school in Atlanta for a while. And so when he died, he left everything to her. And she was able to have that defended first in Sparta, where she won her case with an all-male white jury, and then in the Georgia Supreme Court. And she moved to Augusta and bought the home that the marker will go in front of over on Telfair Street. But she became a leader in the African American philanthropy community, and donated money to people in the Black community who needed help, but also we think donated a good bit of money to Trinity C&E Church, of which she was a member. We haven't been able to prove it, but Eric Montgomery thinks she may have donated money that allowed them to make the renovations they made in the 1890s. In the post-war period, there was more educational opportunity for Black and white women. There were a public school system started in the 1870s, and there were schools for Black children as well as white children. They were coeducational. For white girls at the high school level, we had a man named John Neely found an institute called Neely's Institute, a high school for girls. The schools themselves were paid by the Board of Education, but people, the high schools, but people had to pay tuition to go to the high schools for the operation of them. In 1877, Emily Tubman, the philanthropist, made a large bequest to Neely's Institute and it was renamed in her honor. And in 1917, after the original one burned down on Rimmel Street in the Great Fire of 1916, the new Tubman High School for Girls was built, and of course that building is still there. It was built on the grounds of the old German Schützenplatz. It remained the high school for white girls in Augusta until the 1950s, when ARC was made co-ed. The Sisters of Mercy operated 2 Catholic primary schools. They also founded a hospital, not founded, but worked in the hospitals. And so there were remarkable women. One of the most remarkable was Lucy Craft Laney, and I'm sure that the Education Day is going to have some information on her, but just to remind you, she was born into slavery, but became educated, one of the first graduates after the Civil War, and founded Haynes Institute, originally meant to be for girls, but when boys showed up, she couldn't bear to turn them down. She also began Lamar Nursing School for young African American women, so that kind of goes back to this idea of professionalizing nursing. By the 1900s, there was also what was called the Women's Club movement, and it was definitely underway in Augusta. There are a lot of examples of the kinds of clubs women built. One was the Philanthropy Club, which celebrated its 125th year in 2020. One of the oldest, they think they may be the oldest, can't prove that, but one of the oldest operating in the country. They were also involved in the suffrage movement. And we're going to have a whole lecture on the suffrage movement later. But Augusta women got involved in it a little bit later, maybe, than some of the other areas. But once they were involved, they were really dedicated to it. The mother of suffrage here was sometimes known as Mary Cleckley, and she has the Cleckley family has an interesting story in Augusta. But a lot of the names that you would recognize, including Julia Flish, for example, and Julia Lester Dillon, who was the first female landscape designer in the South that was from Augusta. We see those names in the suffrage movement, and they worked really hard for it. They celebrated when it was passed, when Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment, when 24-year-old Harry Burns changed his mind the morning of the vote because his mother sent him a note, and as he said, a young man has to listen to his mother, which gives you some insight into the power that mothers had within the family, even if they didn't have power in the public. The post-war period, post-World War I, and I will say this, there were Rosie the Riveters here in World War I. There were women working at the Augusta Arsenal in World War I, but I also found women involved in providing all kinds of services. Women learned to drive and would drive messages from the Camp Hancock, into town when they needed to correspond with the local leaders and that kind of thing. They got involved with the Red Cross. They got involved making bandages. So they were very much a part of World War I. After the war, women are also going to become part of the sort of the new generation of women. In July of 1921, women voted in the city of Augusta for the first time. It was a mayoral election. After the 19th Amendment passed, they could not get a registration system set up, and they could not register in time to vote in the 1920 election. So it's 1921, the mayoral election that was won by Julian Smith. And of course, you've heard of Julian Smith Casino. The next month, the city council named 2 women to the Civil Service Commission. So they're beginning to recognize women's right to serve in some of the functions of government. In September of 1921, Laurie Florence became the first woman admitted to the Medical College of Georgia, and she would go on to have a long and successful career as a doctor. In 1924, Catherine Trower became the first Augusta policewoman, and in 1927, Dorothy Levy became the first female to practice law in Augusta. So we are seeing women beginning to emerge in other ways after the suffrage amendment was passed. There's also a roaring side to the 20s, and women were involved in that. We definitely had our flappers here in Augusta. And you can look at the fashions in the newspapers and see how some of those things were changing for women. They're not wearing the corsets of the pre-war period. Their skirts are shorter. Their dresses don't have the yards and yards of material that women used to have to carry around. I mean, some dresses could weigh several pounds in the period before fashions changed. Women bobbed their hair here in Augusta. They danced the Charleston here in Augusta. They went to speakeasies. Augusta was said to have more speakeasies than any other town around. They've identified about, one person said at the time, about 500 of them. Men and women in Augusta dated, and you can read about the letters to the editor in the paper and see how some of this was being taken in by an older generation who just saw it as, scary and almost scandalous. In 1927, a young woman named Agnes Holloman hung by silk stockings from the landing gear of Zig Smith's stunt plane as he flew over Broad Street. When she was interviewed by Ed Cashin years later, she told him that he said, "Weren't you nervous?" And she said, "Oh no, I was young and thought nothing would happen to me." She said, "But I was upset that I'd just gotten my hair bobbed, and flying through there in that plane messed up my permed hair." Anna Pavlova danced at the Imperial Theater. Augustan Ruby Radford became a nationally known writer of children's books. And if we look at the city directory, we can find women working as teachers, librarians, nurses, secretaries, a new profession for women, sales clerk positions in all the department stores that had emerged downtown. In 1925, the Junior College of Augusta was founded, and it was co-ed from the beginning. So women could actually get some college education here. Now, of course, the Depression hit women hard. There were increasing numbers of needy families, and women learned how to take care of them. They recycled things, they reused, they planted large gardens to feed their families. Women who worked were the first to lose their jobs, including female teachers. In fact, in 1934, they would say that any married female teacher had to leave because they were going to give those jobs to men who, quote, had to support their families, in spite of the fact that women were supporting their families. But that's the way it was. The bright spot, of course, in the 30s was Bobby Jones, founding the Augusta National and the first Masters in 34. But less well known is that the women's Titleist golf tournament was held here in Augusta 3 years later, and golfer Babe Dietrichson, who became extremely well known on the women's circuit, played here in Augusta. The 1930s saw the first women's garden club as women began to work to beautify the Augusta community. World War II saw women play an active role. Not only did they plant victory gardens, shop with rationing, and do volunteer work at the USO and other places, but they went back to work in large numbers, partly out of patriotism. And I'm talking about married women as well as unmarried women. They worked in banks. They worked in service stations. We don't hear much about that. And of course, they worked in factories, in jobs that men had left. In Augusta, over 1/3 of the workforce was female in the war. There were women working at the military installations, and so we've got Rosie the Riveters up at the Augusta Arsenal, where they're making lenses for periscopes and lenses for rifles, and helping sight them. And ironically, at the end of the war, many of them wanted to keep working. I mean, if you look at the advertising of the 1950s, it's a concerted effort to get women to go home, because they want the jobs opened up for men. And a lot of women didn't really want to go home, but eventually most of them did. And if you think about the images in movies and television, which is coming into fruition in the 1950s, it's the father knows best, leave it to Beaver, where you may remember June Cleaver vacuumed in high heels and pearls. So that's the new image that's being pushed. In spite of that, they never got all women back home. It becomes increasingly necessary in the last half of the 20th century to have more women working if families were going to stay in the middle class. Women by then were the majority of teachers, the majority of nurses. I'm talking about vast majority. They were the secretaries. They were the sales clerks, especially in certain departments. They might not be in an auto parts area, but they were in clothing, especially children and women's clothing and household items and that sort of thing. In the 1970s, we're going to see a transition occurring again when more and more women are, in some cases, leaving those professions to go into professions that weren't open to them very much before. More and more women are at the Medical College of Georgia and becoming nurses, especially early on in the fields of pediatrics and OBGYN. In other words, things that took care of women and children. We also see more and more female attorneys, women going to law school, coming back to Augusta to practice. We're going to see more women-owned businesses as women began to venture out on their own. We're going to see them then getting involved in things like the Chamber of Commerce, which had been an all-male institution before. And of course, that's both Black women and white women who are getting involved in these kinds of things. And ultimately, we're going to see women getting involved in politics, either running for office themselves or working in the political campaigns of people who were running for office. The first woman on city council was Carrie Mays. She was the first Black female, but she was also the first female, period, to be on the city council. And of course, Carrie was the owner of the Mays Mortuary and the mother of the recently lost to us, a great loss to us, Willie Mays, who also had a career in politics because his mother had set that example for him. And we're going to see women pretty late, almost, 1980s and 90s, beginning to be accepted into civic organizations in town, like Rotary clubs and Kiwanis clubs and other kinds of organizations like that. So it has been a remarkable journey for women over these years. And some of those trends that began in the late 20th century have continued and in some ways accelerated in the 21st century as we see more and more women who are involved in the community in a variety of ways. We have another woman on the city commission with the election of Catherine Smith McKnight, and we don't have enough women on the city commission, But those doors are certainly open now, and it'll be interesting to hear Lynn Bailey talk about the influence of women in politics. I think in the last week we have seen that in a most forceful way with the work of Stacey Abrams and the organizational abilities that led her to be able to have major impact on the 2 Senate races in Georgia. So what began as an almost womanless trading post in 1736, people could not have imagined how far women would come in Augusta, Georgia by the 20th and 21st century. So it's been an interesting road, and I hope you will tune in for the other lectures as we look at some of these topics that I just kind of touched on. I hope enough to pique your interest, but to find out in more depth about individual remarkable women who were involved in some of these aspects of Augusta's growth. So thank you very much. I hope that that you get something out of it today. And again, please email me if you have any specific questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.